brings forth death.
Need to put this up. Will there really be a morning? Is there such a thing as day? Could I see it from the mountains if I were as tall as they? Has it feet like water lilies? Has it feathers like a bird? Is it brought from famous countries of which I have never heard? Oh, some scholar, oh, some sailor, oh, some wise men from the skies, please to tell a little pilgrim where the place called morning lies. The confused looks are telling me that it's not common knowledge that those are lines from Emily Dickinson. And you might be asking, what exactly does she mean by morning? What is the morning for which Dickinson was searching? Given her background, it could be argued that she's thinking of peace, that she's thinking of understanding or wisdom or maybe even God himself. But I want you to pay attention to those first 6 words and how she writes them. Will there really be a morning? It's a question. And a question like this makes me think that she's asking why she ought to go on, and if this morning makes life worth living. She asks if she could see it. She compares it to the things that she knows and understands while wondering if it's from a place she's never heard mentioned before. She asks the scholars, the sailors, these super smart folks and these other folks who have been to various places around the world. And she asks the wise men where she, a little pilgrim, can find this place, this thing called the morning. Now, as is the case with poetry, you may understand that Dickinson does not answer that question. She doesn't tell us explicitly whether she's thinking about some earthly or heavenly reality, a person or a thing, and that mystery seems to in some way be the point. Don't we as well want to know what makes life worth living? Don't we also want to know what we have to look forward to? And by way of a third question, tying all of this together in consideration, at what times in our lives are we the most prone to asking these kinds of questions? When are we the most likely to ask what lies beyond? When are we the most likely to ask what we can know about the life beyond this one? When are we the most predisposed to ask what we have to look forward to? I think it's when we suffer. When we suffer, we are brought to our knees in these questions. It's when we're going through difficult times. It's when we're tested, when we're tried. It's when we're tired and we're just ready to give up. It's when we lose our progress, the assurance, the opportunities, relationships, or people that we have tirelessly prayed for. It's during those times, I think, that we most commonly ask, will there really be a morning? Is there any light at the end of this horrible tunnel for me? If the answer is yes, then we have reason to endure, don't we? If the answer is yes, we have reason to keep going. If the answer is yes, then we must persevere because we know that something wonderful beyond our comprehension is coming. And it is a blessing that for the Christian, the answer is most certainly yes. The morning is coming, and it is far more wonderful than we could ever imagine. Friends, we have to persevere until the morning comes. We must persevere in expectation for our Savior Jesus Christ to come and return for us. We must persevere through every trial and tribulation until we are all at home together in heaven. Indeed, what a day that will be. But until that day, we must spend these days persevering, even under trial. The Bible gives us countless ways to do so, but I want to focus just on 3, all from the first chapter of James, if you'll be turning there. Within those verses, we learn 3 ways through which we persevere under trial. We persevere through hope. We persevere through joy. We persevere through hope, and we persevere through understanding. Faithfulness to God and living a life like his Son, Jesus Christ, it requires the ability to persevere under trial. So how do we do that? In the first place, we must persevere through joy. We must persevere through joy. And how is that possible? James says, starting in verse 2, "Consider it all joy, my brothers, when you fall upon various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And steadfastness must have its perfect result, in order that you might be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." The command to be joyful in trial would be an easy thing, if only it made any sense to us. Embedded within James' mention of various trials, when he says that there, is all kinds of possible scenarios. Trials, temptations, tests, these are all terms that describe the same kind of phenomenon in James chapter 1. A threat upon your livelihood could be just as much a trial as a threat upon your marriage. A threat upon your health could cause a temptation just as much as a threat upon your purity. A threat upon your family could be a test, just so much as it could be a threat upon your sobriety. Why is that the case? Why are all of these things so interchangeable in what we're talking about here? Because they could all end in the exact same result, right? They could all end in our losing our faith in God and deciding to do things our way. And by reading the Bible, you know that always works out well, doesn't it? Any trial, any test, any temptation can result in the loss of your faithfulness and the loss of your very soul. And that's what James is writing to help his readers avoid. And that only can happen by them persevering under trial. And he begins here by speaking of the need for joy. None of the previously mentioned scenarios or any others that you could think of, that I could think of, none of those are inherently joyful ones, right? When we fall upon or encounter various trials, there is no intuitive joy to it. And so in order for us to have the slightest inkling as to why James exhorts us in this way, we need to follow his argumentation. How exactly can we persevere through joy? There's a sequential list of reasons that he provides, and they all have to do with our mindset. For one, we can persevere through joy by seeing trials as test upon our very faith. By seeing trials as test upon our very faith. Look at what he says in verse 3 there, if you remember. What he mentions there is it's knowing that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And that knowledge is a key way that we are to take joy in it. Christians are not to see trials as meaningless. It was Nietzsche who said at one point that man does not repudiate suffering in itself. He doesn't refuse suffering on its own. He wills it. He even seeks it out, provided that he is shown a meaning for it, a purpose for suffering. Some think that in order to not emotionally suffer when we're going through hard times, we should just not be mentally or emotionally attached to any of these things we'd be afraid to lose. We should just let go of it, not worry about it. That idea is called asceticism more commonly, but I don't think that's the right answer. I don't think the right answer is to deny the happiness of life and the blessings that God affords. I don't think we should artificially numb the pain of loss. Instead, James tells us that it's found by viewing every trial as a test. That joy is found by viewing every trial as a test, a means by which our faith can be tested. Yet this leaves the ever important question of why. Why must faith be tested? Well, just as we joyfully persevere by seeing trials as tests, we must also see test as a means to steadfastness. James says to view test as a means to steadfastness in the latter part of verse 3. It's been often said that we should be careful about praying for patience because God will answer that prayer, but maybe not in the way that we would like. Patience only grows when we are tempted to stop being patient. That's how it works. Steadfastness only grows when we're tired of being when we're tired of being steadfast. We can't grow in anything unless we're tested in it. Your memory can't be tested as long as you always have your note cards in front of you. The irony's not lost on me, I know. Your skill can't be tested if you're always practicing. Your heart can't be tested if it's always at ease. How do we mature without opportunities to do so? The testing of our faith results in steadfastness, endurance, patience, whatever word you want to choose. And it's through a shifted focus to that steadfastness that the third part of our method for joyful perseverance can be found in verse 4. See steadfastness as leading to wholeness. As leading to wholeness. The perfect result of our steadfastness is for us to be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Whether you read that as perfect and complete or mature and complete, that's not really the point. The key to all of this is seeing steadfastness as leading to growth. So with that, maybe we now see the full pathway that James has in mind. That tests result in steadfastness, and steadfastness then results in maturity. We become holier, better, and more Christ-like people through being tested and through being tried. And so James urges us to view our sufferings and our hardships as opportunities to grow in our Christian maturity. You might be reminded of 1 Peter chapter 1 here, as there's some similar language in that chapter. And he speaks in verses 1 through 7 of that first chapter of the blessings found in salvation through Jesus Christ and in the hope of heaven that we have through him. But I think his words connect to our present discussion. Just starting from verse 3 in 1 Peter 1, he says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his great mercy has caused us to be born again for a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, for an incorruptible, uncontaminable, and imperishable inheritance, reserved in heaven for you. By God's power they are being protected through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time, in which you rejoice. Now for a short time, if necessary, you are pained by," watch this, "various trials, so that the proof or testing of your faith, more valuable than gold, perishing but tested through fire, may emerge into praise, glory, and honor in the revealing of Jesus Christ." I think within this text there's a parallel of sorts to what we see in James, isn't there? The goal of trial is for our faith to grow stronger, that it can be made ready for the return of Jesus Christ. And in this way we find wholeness in our joyful perseverance. The key to persevering through joy is seeing trials as test, seeing test as producing steadfastness, and seeing steadfastness as resulting in wholeness. In this way, we will indeed lack in nothing, as James says. We'll grow, mature, and progress in the living out of our faith. And most importantly of all, God will be pleased with us. We should take joy in that, and in that fact, in that reality, persevere. So James has thus far shown us to persevere through joy, but he proceeds to give another manner by which we can persevere under trial. After speaking about our need for wisdom and faith, skipping down just a little bit, verse 12 shows us that we must persevere through hope. We must persevere through hope. The Christian life is not about enduring in aimlessness. That is to say, it's not about enduring without any type of a destination in mind. It's about enduring unto our heavenly calling. As James says in verse 12, blessed is the man who endures trial, for having been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which is promised to those who love him. Through what kind of hope are we called to persevere? Per this verse alone, there are a few. For one, we're called to persevere through the hope of blessedness. Through the hope of blessedness. And this is not just about being blessed by God, right? But being an individual whom God calls blessed. There's a slight difference. Whenever God says we are blessed in an attitude or a behavior, we ought to pay some level of attention. Take the Beatitudes of Matthew 5. If the Lord has said that the poor in spirit are blessed, and he has, then we need to be humble. We need to be poor in spirit. If the Lord has said that those who are persecuted are blessed, and he has, then we need to take joy when we're persecuted. So what about when God says that those who endure trials are blessed? I think he's quite frankly saying we need to endure trials. Through endurance, we can be individuals whom God calls blessed. That reality helps us persevere through hope. But we also persevere through the hope of approval. Through the hope of approval. Being approved in the sense meant by James 1 is difficult. And that's why some translations, the ESV has something along the lines of when he has stood the test. This isn't the case every time the term is used, but some contexts imply the approval for a work or for a position. And I think that's what's at play here. We're not speaking of just passing a knowledge-based test. This isn't about Bible Bowl. We're not speaking of God's approval in the sense of him simply liking us or just saying nothing but positive things about us. It's not that shallow. We're speaking of proving ourselves worthy of what we as Christians have been called to do. And in the context of James 1 and verse 12, what we as Christians have been called to receive. We persevere through the hope of approval in that sense. For the work, for the position of Christianity unto our heavenly calling. But once approved, James says that the one who endures trial will receive the crown of life, which is promised to those who love him. And so, yes, we persevere through the hope of blessedness. We persevere through the hope of approval, yes, but additionally through the hope of reward. Through the hope of reward. I agree with the sentiment that Christians should not be so concerned about the reward that we lose focus on just honoring God for the sake of honoring God. However, the New Testament constantly and emphatically shows that there is nothing wrong with hoping for our inheritance. There's nothing wrong with hoping for what's to come. You take Colossians 3, verses 23 and 24, for example. Whatever you do, work from the heart, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that you will receive the recompense or the reward of inheritance from the Lord. You serve the Lord Jesus Christ. By inspiration, the writers of Scripture encourage us to live faithfully in light of our reward. And forgive me, I don't think we're going to be as godly as these writers were. I don't think we'll say it better than they will. So if they say to hope for the reward, I am okay with that. And what is that reward? James 1 and verse 12 says that it's the crown of life. So let's endure through the hope of reward as well. But I do think we need to pay special attention to how the crown of life is described, or rather how its recipients are described. The text says that it is promised to those who love him. We've paid great attention to trials and testing, but did you know that our endurance is to be motivated by love? We're to withstand the trials, the tests, the temptations of life, not only because it's better for us, not only because we become better people, and not only because it betters our relationships. All of those things are true, but that's not the point that James draws out. The point that James draws is we are to endure out of our love for God. Even though the earthly consequences of not enduring trial could be dire for us and for those we love, and that does matter, that should play a part, we are to think of the eternal consequences. Where will I end up if I don't endure in this situation? That's the relevant question for the Christian. Persevere under trial through hope, specifically through the hopes of blessedness, approval, and reward. So we have to persevere through joy and through hope. And I think those two alone, I could ask you to stand and sing and we'd be fine. But both just by way of what the general style of preaching is, and also just because James just has another thing to say, there's a third point here, I think. James offers one more manner by which we must persevere under trial, and this one I think is the most important. James urges us to persevere through understanding. Through understanding. Consider verses 13 through 15 with me now in James 1. As Chip read for us just a few moments ago, let no one say when tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God is incapable of being tempted by evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted by his own desire, as he is enticed and lured. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, having been brought to term, gives birth to death. We are to persevere through understanding. Persevering through joy and through hope are connected to that, but James makes a special note of understanding here. So note in the first place, we need to persevere through understanding the nature of God. Understanding the nature of God. James says in verse 13 to understand the nature of God. Let no one say when tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God is incapable of being tempted by evil, and he himself tempts no one, verse 13 says. Follow me here for a moment. It's important to note that when you find this verb that's translated tempt, it shares a root with this noun you find throughout James 1. That's translated as test or trial or temptation, whatever you might have. Word roots don't always matter. That's a big deal to bear in mind. They don't. They're generally very unimportant without a context that makes them important. But when you find an author using both terms repeatedly, I think the author is saying this is important to understand. And so James himself, in this context that he himself made, would seem to have us draw a connection. And he repeatedly uses this noun throughout the chapter, and now he uses the verb of the same root in verse 13. What in the world is the point here? Our initial impulse when we get to verse 13, it might be to say that God does not test, try, or tempt anyone for any reason and in any way. The idea comes from a pure place, and as we're going to see, God doesn't test people with evil. And I think that's generally what we mean. But the Bible nowhere says that God doesn't test. And as a matter of fact, it repeatedly says the exact opposite of that. Note, for example, Genesis 22 and verse 1. This is a narrative, of course, when Abraham is told to sacrifice his son Isaac, for whom he waited 25 years. And verse 1 says there, it came to pass after these things that God, notice this, tested Abraham. How about Exodus 15 and verse 25? And that this is after the people complain about the bitter water. It says, so Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log. He threw it into the water, and the water was sweetened. There the Lord made a decree and judgment for them, and there he tested them. So whether you are looking at in English, you're looking at the Hebrew verb that's used in both of these texts, the Greek verb used in translation, both refer to testing, trying, tempting. They're all over these texts. And it's intriguing to me that same Greek verb that you find is the one that you find in James 1 here. Regardless of language that we're speaking of, just consider with me, if I as a translator think that a word is completely off limits in regards to describing God and what he does, why would I use it? I think sometimes we get the wrong idea. The term wouldn't appear in Genesis 22, it wouldn't appear in Exodus 15 and the like. And my point is to say here, We need to be careful of saying that God does not test, try, or tempt in any way, because the Bible doesn't say that. And at the very least, it says he's done so before. James 1:13 is not telling you that God will never tempt you or test you, but that God will never tempt you, notice, with evil. That's the difference, with evil. The verse says God cannot be tempted with evil, and the next clause implies that that kind of temptation is the one the Lord will not put his people through. So he tests us, but he does not test us with evil, with wickedness, and with anything that would tear us away from him if we indulge. We've been studying Job this quarter on Sunday mornings. I think it's really hard to read that book and not come away thinking that God won't test how faithful you are. Now, I think it's important to note, as with the case of Job, God expects that we are going to do really well in these tests. He has the utmost confidence in us. And there are still these moral expectations that are attached to the test. But what I'm saying to you here is that God will not tempt you to murder, to lie, to steal, to commit adultery, or anything like that. Those types of tests, 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 5 would tell us, are Satan's doing. But even then, the devil doesn't make you do anything as well. You know that, right? God does not test for sinful purposes. It's not his nature. And so this contrast is why verses 16 through 18 describe God as the giver of every good and perfect gift, and as the Father of lights, because he only gives us that which is good for our spiritual well-being, even if he presents trials along the way, even when he presents trials along the way. There are some tragedies that happen in our lives, certain hardships that occur that really do just happen without any reason behind them. They're senseless. I think it's wrong to say that Romans 8:28 is saying that everything happens for a reason in light of that. What the verse seems to be saying instead is that everything that happens, every trial, every test, every temptation, everything that happens can be for a reason if we allow it to have one. And if we use it for the reason that God has afforded us to see. God can use anything for good, even though the circumstance in question may be anything but good. That is his nature. We need to have an understanding of the nature of God. That will help us persevere. But we also need to understand the nature of sin. We need to understand the nature of sin. But each person is tempted by his own desire, as he is enticed and lured. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, having been brought to term, gives birth to death, brings forth death. Sin is the result of failure against temptation. There is no sin in temptation itself. That's how we know that when Hebrews 4:15 says that Jesus was tempted in every way and yet without sin, that's how we understand. But look at how James describes the progression of how sin happens in our lives. Our own desires lead us in. We're lured and enticed by them, like fish are by a bait, right? And then verse 15 tells us desire conceives, eventually giving birth to sin. That sin slowly grows, it develops, and it results ultimately in death. What James' imagery does is it provides us with this crucial irony that what is otherwise a picture of life is here a picture of death. And that's what sin does. By way of application with this, sin is no one's fault but your own. Sin is always a choice. Sin never just happens. It is always the result of being drawn away by your own desires. God didn't make you do it. Satan didn't make you do it. You made you do it. So in order to persevere, you need to be honest with yourself. You need to look in the mirror. And I'm saying for myself too, you need to face the fact that no one made you sin. No matter how agitated nor attracted to whatever it is in question, sin happens when you give in. It is as simple as that. And along that line, sin has consequences. It's never a victimless crime. nor is it ever just a white lie. It always puts you at spiritual risk. It must always be the subject of repentance. It could result in the loss of your very soul. And so I ask you, is it worth it? Is it worth it to not endure in the face of this trial, temptation, or test? Is it worth that moment of satisfaction? Is it worth that last word that ends in heartbreak? Is it worth that deceit that boosted your resume? It never is. You may think that sin will help you. It will do nothing but harm you, and that is God's promise. James urges us to understand the nature of sin just as much as he urges us to understand the nature of God. Both are of the utmost importance. So we have to persevere under trial through understanding. There was a Holocaust survivor whose name was Viktor Frankl, and he was writing in this book he wrote called Man's Search for Meaning about, as the title implies, helping people find their meaning. It's his whole therapeutic approach. And he wrote within that book, once an individual's search for a meaning is successful, it not only renders him happy, but also gives him the capability to cope with suffering. And what happens if one's groping for a meaning has been in vain? This may well result in a fatal condition. We understand this is true in our context as well, I'm sure, but meaning in our lives, finding that meaning in our lives, especially through trials, is how we get through them. So it's only natural that we try to find meaning, that we try to make answers. Sometimes that results in really, really bad answers, dangerous answers that are band-aids for a broken bone. But we do tend to try and do anything to scrape for some confidence and some courage. I think what James provides is a better solution, a simpler solution, a more biblical solution than making up an answer that might seem good in the moment. And James teaches us to persevere through joy, through hope, and through understanding. And I pray that you will do just that. Having a more nuanced and God-centered understanding of perseverance not only encourages us, but it strengthens us authentically. So I urge you, please do not give up. Feel your pain. Don't undermine your emotions, but don't give up. Pray, fellowship, study. Keep coming to worship, but don't give up in the midst of your hardship. I think about this quote. It's from a Stoic philosopher, and so I obviously don't buy into that. But when you change a few of his words around, I think that there's an applicable principle here for us to close with. Who then is a Christian? Show me a man, in this sense modeled after the doctrines that are ever upon his lips. Show me a man that is sick and happy, an exile and happy, an evil report and happy. Show me him. I ask again, oh, how I long to see one Christian. I'm not sure what your needs are tonight, what you've been going through, what your family and your friends have been enduring. But I urge you tonight, as James does, keep going, persevere, look forward to the reward, both the place that we're going and the person with whom we'll get to enjoy that with. If you have any need whatsoever, we ask that you would come at this time as we stand and sing.
What can wash away